as it is. Okay, well, while we switch presentations, I'm Diane Pataki from the University of Utah, and I recently changed institutions. So I spent 8 years at the University of California, Irvine in the Los Angeles area. So my perspective has been very strongly influenced by the fact that I've studied urban forests in dry places. In Los Angeles and in Salt Lake City, my work on urban forests actually began in Salt Lake City. So what I'm going to talk about today is I'm just going to bring up a few points. It's not a very intense presentation because of the time. Mostly I want to bring up some points for discussion, but I want to talk about ecosystem services as a tool in addition to a conceptual framework. And I want to talk about expanding our toolbox a little bit. So one of the suggestions that I have for our discussions later is about the toolbox that we need for designing and planning and managing urban forests. Now, courtesy of Hurricane Sandy, I had a few extra weeks to think about this presentation, so I've changed my title. And my title now includes the words, Resolving the Desert Forest Paradox. I've gone to a lot of meetings on urban ecosystem services, and I'm often the desert person, the person who comes from a desert city to talk about how we deal with trees in a landscape where trees are not native. Next slide, please. So this is where I currently live. This is my home. And I like this slide very much. I've actually used it for many years. In the foreground here, we see the unmanaged ecosystem surrounding Salt Lake City. So if you do nothing, you get a landscape that really has no trees, except in very wet areas like riparian areas. And it's seasonally dry. In fact, it's brown for much of the year. And then in the background, you see this incredible landscape that we've created. Almost every tree that you see is planted, because this is a very, very, very heavily designed and modified ecosystem. So I actually don't think that desert forests, desert urban forests are fundamentally different than, say, eastern urban forests, but they are a more extreme example of a novel ecosystem, a human-created ecosystem that has no natural analogy. And there are many, many implications to thinking about how we plan and design and manage an ecosystem like that. Next slide, please. So this figure you may recognize. This figure comes from one of the very first papers on quantifying global natural capital, the value of global natural ecosystem services, from the paper by Costanza in 1997. And does anyone remember the value of urban ecosystems in this study? It was set to 0. And that reflected a very common view by ecologists at the time, that urban ecosystems had very, very little value. So it's a little bit ironic that we have imported this concept of ecosystem services from the natural ecosystem community, of which I was a part for many years. My training is in natural ecology. So, you know, it's not a perfect marriage between ecosystem services and urban ecosystems, because ironically, ecosystem services as a concept arose because ecologists wanted to save natural ecosystems from development and from urban development, right? This concept was showing that we need to preserve natural systems because they have unacknowledged values that society didn't really fully realize. But what happens when we are designing ecosystems to have acknowledged values? I kind of think that I've been asking the wrong question for the last few years. The question that I've been asking is, well, what kind of value do trees have in a desert environment? But actually, you know, I struggled a lot with that question, and I'll show you why. But really, what I should have been asking and what I'm asking now is, what's the best possible city that we could design? And that's a bigger question than ecosystem services. Next slide, please. Now, if you take the ecosystem services framework to its ultimate conclusion, Salt Lake City should look like this. This is the natural ecosystem in the Salt Lake Valley, the Great Basin Desert Sagebrush Community. This is not the city that I want. So how do we get the city that we want? And that I've spent a lot of time pondering that question, and as a matter of fact, I changed institutions specifically because I've moved to a university where we're thinking about these tools for urban planning in a broader context. So I'm going to throw out some ideas today on this, and they're really just straw man ideas. I've not been doing this thinking exercise for a very long time, so I'm very, very open to other ideas. But let's just play with some different concepts for the urban ecosystems toolbox, or rather the urban ecological planning toolbox. Next slide, please. Okay, so I've showed this slide many times at various meetings. My lab has spent a lot of time and effort and money quantifying the water use of desert urban forests. These are data from Los Angeles. So what you see on the y-axis is the water use of Los Angeles urban forests in units of millimeters of water per day. And what you see on the x-axis is tree density. More trees you have, the more water they're going to use. There's also a very strong species effect here that I'll talk about further. But basically, these ecosystems, they are going to have a lot of costs, environmental costs and monetary costs. They are designed ecosystems, they're artificial ecosystems, and they cannot exist without a huge resource input from humans. But that's okay, actually. So that's kind of where my thinking has moved. I mean, I spent a long time going to meetings like this and showing people, look, these forests are using a lot of water. How are we going to deal with that? Next slide, please. So I think we have ways of dealing with it. I want to talk about some tools that I think we need to put in our toolbox. Many people already are. You're probably familiar with many of these. I've worked a bit in the area of urban metabolism. Rich alluded to this tool. It's related to the ecological footprint tool. And so actually there was an excellent special issue in the Journal of Industrial Ecology in December, all about urban metabolism, really good papers in there. So this is one tool that we can use, and urban metabolism quantifies the total resource use of cities and the total waste product of cities. And I recently had my class, I teach urban ecology, try and construct an urban metabolism for Utah cities, and they had a really hard time because the data are not readily available. So it is difficult to actually quantify the total energy use of your city, the total waste. Sometimes actually some of the waste streams are well quantified, other waste streams are not well quantified. Greenhouse gas emissions, difficult to quantify. The data are just not public for cities. We collect greenhouse gas emissions data at the state level. So we have some data constraints here, but urban metabolism is very useful because it can give us a sense of how our urban forest contributes to the big picture of urban resource use and pollution. And that's what we need to do to move towards urban sustainability. Next slide, please. So in lots of my papers and talks, I've talked about carbon sequestration of urban trees, and I've talked about the fact that from an urban metabolism perspective, it's pretty small compared to fossil fuel emissions. So I've shown this a number of times, but we did an urban metabolism study of LA County. The black areas show the urbanized portion of LA County, and it doesn't actually matter what the actual carbon sequestration of LA trees is. If you look at the maximum possible carbon sequestration of the ecosystem in Los Angeles, just take the average for wet forests, even though Los Angeles is not a wet forest. It's just trivial compared to fossil fuel emissions in Los Angeles. Fossil fuel emissions are massively concentrated in a small area. We are going to have to plant trees and enhance soil carbon in a much larger area than cities to make a dent in our urban CO2 emissions. But urban metabolism actually has told us that this isn't the whole story either. Next slide, please. I've also shown this figure many times, though we never published it, but this is the relationship between the surface air temperature and percent tree cover in Los Angeles. It comes from satellite image. This is Astor. You see the cool areas there where there are lots of trees. Huge effect. Actually, a 20-degree effect in Fahrenheit when you go from a tree cover of close to 0 all the way up to 70%. Trees have this huge cooling effect. I actually think this is mostly due to shading, but I don't have time to talk about that today. So trees have a big cooling effect. Next slide, please. And that strongly influences greenhouse gas emissions, at least potentially. This is the function in California between electricity demand and average daily temperature. If you're in the very, I guess I have a pointer. If you're in the very sensitive part of this curve here, next slide, and you can change your local air temperature right around your building. It doesn't have to be over the whole city. By 5 degrees, you can reduce your greenhouse gas emissions by 15%. And that's much bigger than anything you're going to get by carbon sequestration. And I think that's a very useful application of urban metabolism to understanding the role of the urban forests. Because a forest designed to maximize carbon sequestration might look pretty different than a forest that's supposed to reduce the energy use of your building. So we have to know the exact mechanisms by which urban forests can influence urban sustainability. Next slide. Okay, well, the other tool I want to talk about comes from green infrastructure and not the ecological side of green infrastructure, from the engineering side. So I thought long and hard about how to include a photo from Star Trek in my talk at the National Academy, and I found a way. Anyone recognize this is the Starfleet Academy from Star Trek: The Next Generation? Despite the CGI'd Golden Gate Bridge in the background, Starfleet Academy, the set of this is actually a water reclamation plant in LA called the Tillman Water Reclamation Plant, sewage treatment plant. But you didn't know that. Or maybe you did. It's actually kind of a famous plant because they do tertiary treatment of water and they use it to irrigate these Japanese gardens, and you can have weddings there and stuff. But my point is actually that we talk a lot about the sanitary city and about gray infrastructure, and we talk about gray infrastructure as being bad. I actually want to highlight something about gray infrastructure that I think is useful, and that's that we don't need to quantify its ecosystem services, in that we have not needed to justify the value of flushing toilets in the United States. We have to treat sewage to meet Clean Water Act standards, right? It's a federal law. So we may not have to prove that the monetary value of forests exceeds its maintenance costs. However, we may need to prove that our green infrastructure, like here's a bioswale, that these features meet environmental standards or regulatory standards. And that, I think, would make people very interested in investing in green infrastructure and in forests. But that really raises the bar for us as ecologists. I'm an ecologist, because we have not really provided science that could allow us to design systems to that level of specificity, right? We like to plant bioswales, but we often don't know exactly what pollution concentrations we're going to get or how much pollution we're going to remove from stormwater runoff, for example. I do think the science is there to do that, though. I think we can raise the bar on our research agenda to provide that information. And that will facilitate this transition, at least in my mind, from gray to green infrastructure. But we've got to be able to provide the same design specifications for green infrastructure that we do for gray infrastructure. Next slide, please. And that brings me to my species. I love to talk about species, so I slipped this in here. We do have this excellent data on the water use of different species, for example. So my solution to the desert forest paradox is that some species use a lot less water than others. If we talk about infrastructure and we talk about design specifications, I can tell you which species will use less water and which may enhance other ecosystem services. As Rich was talking about, there are trade-offs. We have species that do have a very high water use efficiency. That is, they grow rather quickly for a rather low amount of water use, and they provide shade for a rather low amount of water use. So I think we can provide a good cooling effect for hot cities without using a lot of irrigation water. Next slide. Okay, see, I'm just whipping through this. I didn't want to cram too much stuff in here. I just have one last tool in my toolbox that I want to offer you. Many of you are familiar with this sort of thing. But we talk a lot in ecosystem services about how do we quantify the cultural ecosystem services, right? Big topic of discussion. The values that people hold and their perspectives on trees, their preferences for trees are hugely important, we all know from working in urban forests. We talk about how to quantify that, but we don't have to reinvent the wheel, because there are all of these existing planning and visioning processes for cities and for metropolitan regions that have already taken place. They tend not to involve trees, but we can still utilize the approach. In Utah, we have a very famous case of Envision Utah, which was a project that took place in the 1990s. It was a statewide project, statewide visioning project, and it had several steps. It had nothing to do with trees, but it did involve stakeholders at many levels to establish a visioning process for looking at the future of Utah. Utah has a very high population rate of increase. That's not because of immigration. It's because Utah has the highest birth rate in the United States, similar to Mexico, actually. So Utah, it's going to urbanize. The real estate market did not put a dent in the urbanization of Utah. So, citizens of Utah want to know what should Utah look like in the next few decades. And they undertook a large planning process that was very inclusive, involved a lot of stakeholders. Stakeholders together established the scope of work. They discussed local values. That's something we all struggle with as ecologists, right? Values. How do we deal with local values? But there are processes for determining local values. And they did a lot of scenario planning. They held a lot of public meetings, and they envisioned their preferred future. Wouldn't it be great to do that for trees? I mean, there are some small scale examples of doing that, but I mean a really large scale effort to envision our future city that involves detailed looks at the green space. What should the green space really look like? Its density, its spatial distribution, its species. Next slide, please. Utah is kind of starting to do that because Envision Utah has sort of a grandchild. And so just the urbanized part of Utah in the north, the Wasatch Front, where Salt Lake City is, has a new visioning process called Wasatch Choice for 2040. And they have decided to make a new planning tool. And it builds on an existing planning tool. There are lots of urban planning tools out there that many of you know about. And this one uses one called Envision Tomorrow, which is a commercial tool. It's offered by a consulting firm. And my colleagues, Chris Nelson, Reed Ewing, and Sarah Hinners, are creating Envision Tomorrow Plus, ET Plus, which always confuses us because I always think they're talking about evapotranspiration, but they're talking about Envision Tomorrow. And so this is a tool that allows you to paint different options, different outcomes for your urban area on a GIS framework. So you can look at different housing densities and so forth. And what they'd like to do is include additional apps to Envision Tomorrow that include things like urban metabolism, the environmental outcomes of different urban designs, and ecosystem services. The initial effort at this is merging iTree with ET to make ET+. But I think we can go even further than that. Next slide, please. This is my, my wish list for my toolbox. We could add to this, or we could, I hope we discuss this, but I'm calling this the Ecological Planning Toolbox. Ecological planning is a term that is used very much at my institution. We have a new Ecological Planning Center, and it draws on pieces, different tools from different disciplines. In urban ecology, we have talked about ecosystem services for some time. We've talked about urban metabolism for some time. We also have these tools from green infrastructure and engineering. And so here's where we get to these performance goals, very specific metrics, things we can measure. And that's convenient because urban ecology and engineering share a love of metrics, quantitative metrics, and monitoring programs. But then from the planning, urban planning, landscape architecture, and design fields, we bring in these tools that evaluate community values and that do community visioning and that look at things like the meaning of trees for people in the landscape and beauty, because these landscapes have to be beautiful or they're not going to be accepted. And there are lots of overlaps between these different disciplines, but here in the middle, I say if we can combine all the pieces of these tools together, the pieces that we want, we can have this complete ecological planning toolbox. So that's sort of my dream. And the last slide, if you advance, oh, the second to last slide. So this ecological planning toolbox is actually how I propose to solve the desert forest paradox. That even if we decide that trees are costly to maintain in deserts, and they are, that we still want them. And so we still need a way for assessing why people want them in the landscape, assessing what we want them to do, measuring and monitoring that, and then implementing that in a framework that's sustainable. Okay, the next slide is the last one. So this is my wish list for what I think the ecological planning tool should look like. And I don't think there's any current tool that does all of this, not that I know of. But there are lots of existing tools that do pieces of it. So I do think it's tractable to build this tool. And my dream tool would be very specific to place, so that the tool knows that you're in a desert, knows that you're in a wet area, it knows that you're in a wetland. It's spatially explicit. This is a tough one, but we have that computational power now, and we're getting towards the mechanistic understanding of how urban ecosystems work to quantify the spatially explicit relationships. It would use visualization methods. I think this is quite important, actually, so that people can develop a shared vision and have a common framework for looking for options for the future city that they want. And we have to include community and different stakeholders, and we have to integrate community values into these plans. And it would also scale up to look at the total urban metabolism, the stocks and flows of energy and matter, and then finally, it would be tied to real metrics that we could measure and monitor in the future. So that's my wish list. That was fun to be able to tell you about that, and I look forward to talking about that more at this meeting. Thank you.